the fluorescent lights of Metro General Hospital's emergency room flickered with an ominous uncertainty as Dr. Sarah Chen completed her 16th hour of what should have been a 12-hour shift. The digital clock on the wall read 3:47 a.m., and the usual late-night calm that typically settled over the hospital during these early morning hours was shattered by the screech of ambulance sirens growing closer. Sarah rubbed her tired eyes and reached for her third cup of coffee, the bitter liquid barely keeping her alert after the grueling night of treating everything from heart attacks to car accident victims. She had no idea that her life was about to change forever, or that the approaching ambulances carried something far more terrifying than any medical emergency she had ever encountered. The first ambulance crashed through the emergency bay doors with such force that the automatic sensors couldn't react quickly enough, causing the paramedics to slam their gurney against the entrance frame. "We've got multiple casualties incoming," shouted paramedic Rodriguez, his voice carrying an edge of panic that Sarah had never heard in her 10 years of emergency medicine. "Some kind of mass hysteria event downtown, people are attacking each other, biting, clawing. We've got 17 more units responding, but the victims, they're not responding to sedatives and their strength is off the charts." Sarah's training kicked in immediately as she directed the incoming patient to Trauma Bay 3, but something about the victim's appearance made her stomach turn. The man on the gurney was middle-aged, probably a businessman judging by his torn suit, but his eyes were completely bloodshot, his skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and when he suddenly lunged at the paramedic, his movements were jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. Marcus Rodriguez, the hospital's head of security and a decorated veteran of 2 tours in Afghanistan, was reviewing the night's incident reports when his radio crackled to life with reports of disturbances throughout the hospital. As a former Marine, Marcus had seen his share of violence and chaos, but something about the reports filtering through the hospital's communication system sent chills down his spine. "Security to emergency room immediately," came the desperate voice of Nurse Johnson, followed by what sounded like screaming and the crash of medical equipment. Marcus grabbed his radio and ran toward the emergency department, his military training automatically assessing potential threats and escape routes as he moved through the hospital's maze-like corridors. When he rounded the corner into the emergency room, what he saw defied everything he thought he knew about human behavior and medical science. 3 blocks away, Detective Alex Thompson was finishing his patrol shift when the first emergency calls began flooding the police dispatch system. "All units, we have reports of violent disturbances at multiple locations throughout the downtown area," announced the dispatcher, her usually calm voice betraying signs of stress and confusion. "Citizens are reporting unprovoked attacks, multiple injuries, and what appears to be mass hysteria. Exercise extreme caution." Alex had been a police officer for 8 years, and he thought he had seen every form of human violence and depravity that the city could produce, but as he responded to the first call at a 24-hour diner, he witnessed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The infected, as he would later learn to call them, moved with a horrifying combination of superhuman strength and complete disregard for their own safety, attacking anyone within reach with a primal hunger that seemed to override all human instinct and reason. Back at the hospital, Sarah found herself barricaded in the pediatric wing with Marcus and a small group of nurses and patients, trying to make sense of the chaos that had erupted throughout the medical facility. The infected patients had overwhelmed the emergency room within minutes, their violent behavior spreading like wildfire as they attacked staff and other patients with a ferocity that defied medical explanation. "It's like they're not human anymore," whispered Nurse Patricia, clutching a young patient to her chest as the sound of breaking glass and inhuman screams echoed through the hospital corridors. Sarah's scientific mind struggled to process what she was witnessing, but her survival instincts were telling her that whatever was happening was far beyond the scope of any medical emergency she had been trained to handle. The infected showed no response to pain, no recognition of family members or friends, and their only apparent motivation was to attack and bite any uninfected person they encountered. As the first rays of dawn began to filter through the hospital windows, Sarah, Marcus, and the other survivors realized that their nightmare was just beginning. The city's communication systems were failing, emergency services were overwhelmed, and the infection was spreading faster than anyone had anticipated. The sound of the infected breaking through the main entrance barricades echoed through the hospital's corridors, and the backup generators that had been keeping the lights on began to sputter and fail, plunging sections of the building into darkness where unspeakable horrors awaited in the shadows. The pale morning light filtering through the hospital's shattered windows revealed the true scope of the nightmare that had consumed Metro General Hospital overnight. Dr. Sarah Chin stood at the reinforced doors of the pediatric wing, her white coat stained with blood that wasn't her own, watching as the infected wandered through the corridors below like lost souls searching for something they could never find. The emergency lighting cast eerie shadows across the walls, and the constant groaning and shuffling of the infected created a symphony of horror that seemed to seep into the very foundation of the building. Marcus Rodriguez checked his watch and realized they had been barricaded in the pediatric wing for nearly 6 hours, but it felt like an eternity since the first infected patient had transformed their workplace into a battleground between the living and the dead. "We can't stay here much longer," Marcus whispered to Sarah as he peered through the reinforced glass windows of the security door, his military training automatically cataloging the movements and behaviors of the infected below. "The backup generators are failing, and once we lose power completely, those electronic locks won't hold. We need to find another way out before they figure out how to get up here." Sarah nodded grimly, her medical mind still struggling to process what she had witnessed throughout the night. The infected showed no signs of pain response, no recognition of former colleagues or patients, and their behavior followed no logical pattern that her years of medical training could explain. More disturbing was the discovery that the infection seemed to have a delayed onset, meaning that anyone who had been bitten or scratched could potentially transform without warning, turning trusted allies into deadly enemies in a matter of hours. Detective Alex Thompson's radio crackled to life with static and fragmented reports from across the city, painting a picture of widespread chaos that extended far beyond the hospital walls. "All units, be advised that the downtown area has been declared a no-go zone," came the dispatcher's voice, barely audible through the interference. "Multiple reports of violent incidents throughout the metropolitan area. Emergency services are overwhelmed. Seek shelter and await further instructions." Alex had been trying to reach the hospital ever since losing contact with his patrol partner during the initial outbreak, and now he found himself trapped in an abandoned office building 3 blocks away, watching the infected pour through the streets like a human tsunami of destruction and hunger. From her apartment building's rooftop, Elena Vasquez adjusted the makeshift antenna she had constructed from spare electronics and building materials, her engineering background proving invaluable in the chaos that had engulfed the city. As a communications engineer for the city's emergency services, Elena had been monitoring radio frequencies throughout the night, piecing together fragments of information from police, fire, and medical emergency broadcasts. What she had learned painted a terrifying picture of systematic infrastructure failure and the complete breakdown of organized resistance to the infection. Emergency broadcast to all survivors, Elena transmitted on the emergency frequency, her voice carrying across the city's communication networks. "This is Elena Vasquez, City Communications Engineer. Military forces have established quarantine zones, but the closest safe zone is 12 miles away through infected territory. Anyone receiving this transmission, please respond with your location and status." Sarah's handheld radio, which Marcus had retrieved from the security office, suddenly came alive with Elena's transmission, providing the first glimmer of hope they had experienced since the outbreak began. "This is Dr. Sarah Chen at Metro General Hospital," she responded, her voice trembling with exhaustion and relief. "We have approximately 15 survivors, including several injured patients who cannot be moved without medical support. Our current location is secure, but our supplies are limited, and we estimate we have less than 12 hours before our position becomes untenable." Elena's response was immediate and filled with the kind of practical information that only someone with her technical expertise could provide. "Dr. Chin, I've been monitoring emergency broadcasts throughout the night. The infection is spreading faster than the authorities anticipated, and traditional emergency response protocols have failed. However, I've identified several safe routes through the city's infrastructure that might allow us to reach the military quarantine zone." As the 3 survivors established communication, Detective Alex Thompson made his way through the abandoned office building, using his police training to navigate the infected streets and reach the hospital where he hoped to find other survivors. His journey through the city revealed the true scope of the outbreak, with abandoned vehicles, shattered storefronts, and the unmistakable signs of panicked evacuation attempts that had failed when the infection spread faster than anyone had anticipated. The infected he encountered showed disturbing signs of adaptation and coordination, moving in loose groups and responding to sounds and movements with increasing efficiency. What had started as mindless violence was evolving into something far more dangerous, suggesting that the virus was not only transforming human biology but also enhancing certain cognitive functions while eliminating others. The convergence of Sarah, Marcus, Alex, and Elena marked the beginning of an unlikely alliance that would prove crucial to their survival in the days ahead. Each brought unique skills and knowledge that would be essential for navigating the challenges of a world where the fundamental rules of human society had been completely rewritten. As they prepared to leave the relative safety of their current positions, they realized that their greatest enemy might not be the infected themselves, but the rapidly deteriorating infrastructure and the unknown variables of an evolving contagion that seemed to be growing more intelligent and dangerous with each passing hour. The decision to leave the hospital came when the infected finally breached the pediatric wing's reinforced doors, their combined weight and relentless pounding having worn down the electronic locking mechanisms that had protected the survivors throughout the night. Dr. Sarah Chin grabbed the emergency medical kit while Marcus Rodriguez secured the group's limited weapons, consisting of a fire axe, 2 security batons, and a nail gun from the hospital's maintenance department. The 15 survivors, including 3 injured patients who had to be supported by others, began their descent through the hospital's service corridors toward the basement level where Elena Vasquez had directed them to access the city's extensive subway tunnel system. The infected had filled the main corridors of the hospital, their moans and shuffling footsteps creating an audio landscape of terror that seemed to follow the survivors no matter how quietly they moved through the building's hidden passages. Detective Alex Thompson had successfully navigated 3 blocks of infected streets to reach the hospital, his police training and intimate knowledge of the city's layout allowing him to avoid the large groups of infected that had congregated around major intersections and commercial areas. His journey had revealed disturbing patterns in the infected's behavior, including their tendency to investigate sounds and movements with increasing sophistication, suggesting that whatever virus had transformed them was continuing to evolve and adapt. When Alex finally reached the hospital's basement level through a service entrance, he found Sarah's group preparing to enter the subway tunnels, their faces reflecting the same mixture of determination and terror that he had been carrying since the outbreak began. The subway tunnels beneath the city offered a temporary refuge from the infected hordes above ground, but they presented their own unique challenges and dangers that the survivors had not anticipated. Elena's voice crackled through their handheld radios, providing navigation instructions from her rooftop position where she could monitor both the tunnel systems and the street-level situation. "The main subway line is flooded from last week's storm," Elena reported, her engineering expertise proving invaluable as she guided them through the complex underground network. "You'll need to take the maintenance tunnels to avoid the water, but be aware that the city's storm drainage system connects to those passages, and I'm detecting movement in several sections that suggest the infected have found their way underground." As the group moved deeper into the tunnel system, they encountered their first group of fellow survivors, a family of 4 who had been trapped in the Riverside shopping mall when the outbreak began. The Henderson family, consisting of parents Michael and Janet along with their teenage children Emma and David, had managed to survive by barricading themselves in the mall's security office, but their supplies had run out and they were desperately seeking a way to reach safety. Their stories of the outbreak's progression above ground painted a picture of complete social breakdown, with emergency services overwhelmed and military response focused on containing the infection rather than rescuing survivors. The mall had become a death trap when the infected began displaying pack-hunting behavior, working together to breach the survivors' defenses and coordinated attacks that suggested a level of intelligence that defied everything the survivors thought they knew about the infection. The expanded group's progress through the tunnels was interrupted when they encountered a second group of survivors, but this meeting proved far more dangerous than their encounter with the Henderson family. The college students from Metropolitan University had initially seemed like potential allies, their youth and energy offering hope for the group's survival chances. But their leader, a philosophy major named Derek, had developed a disturbing philosophy about the outbreak that put the entire group at risk. Derek believed that the infected represented the next stage of human evolution, and his followers had begun displaying erratic behavior that suggested they were intentionally exposing themselves to the infection in some misguided attempt to join what they saw as humanity's inevitable transformation. The philosophical conflict between Derek's group and the survivors became a secondary threat when the infected began appearing in the tunnels, their presence forcing both groups to work together despite their fundamental disagreements about the nature of the outbreak. The chase sequence through the underground tunnel system became a nightmare of split-second decisions and desperate survival tactics as the infected demonstrated their ability to navigate the dark tunnels with disturbing efficiency. Sarah's medical training became crucial when several members of the group were injured during the escape, and Marcus's military experience proved invaluable in organizing the survivors' defensive movements through the claustrophobic underground passages. The tunnels began flooding when the infected's movements triggered the city's emergency drainage systems, creating a race against time as the survivors navigated through rising water while being pursued by infected who seemed unaffected by the flooding. Elena's voice guided them through the chaos, her engineering knowledge of the city's infrastructure providing the only hope of finding an escape route to the surface. The part culminated in a desperate climb through a maintenance shaft that led to the city's financial district, where the survivors emerged into daylight to find themselves in a completely transformed urban landscape where the infected had begun establishing territorial patterns and displaying coordinated group behaviors that suggested the virus was not only spreading but evolving into something far more dangerous than anyone had initially realized. The financial district of the city had been transformed into an urban wasteland where abandoned vehicles created makeshift barriers between towering glass buildings that reflected the morning sun like mirrors of a broken world. Dr. Sarah Chen led the exhausted group of survivors through the maze of overturned cars and debris, her medical training keeping her alert to signs of injury and fatigue among the 15 people who now depended on her leadership. The Henderson family stayed close together, their teenage children Emma and David helping to support the injured survivors from the hospital while their parents Michael and Janet kept watch for signs of the infected who had been tracking them since their escape from the underground tunnels. Detective Alex Thompson used his knowledge of the city's layout to guide them toward the First National Bank building, a fortress-like structure that Elena Vasquez had identified as their best option for temporary shelter while they planned their next move toward the military quarantine zone. The bank building's reinforced construction and advanced security systems had made it an ideal refuge for other survivors, and when Sarah's group approached the main entrance, they were met by armed guards who had established a careful screening process to ensure that no infected individuals could infiltrate their sanctuary. The guards, led by a former police captain named Robert Hayes, explained that they had been monitoring radio communications and had heard Elena's broadcasts, but they had also learned to be cautious about accepting new survivors after several dangerous encounters with infected who had retained enough intelligence to mimic human behavior. The screening process involved a mandatory 24-hour quarantine period for all new arrivals, during which time they would be observed for signs of infection while their stories were verified through careful questioning and cross-referencing with other survivors' accounts. Inside the bank building, the survivors discovered a well-organized community of nearly 40 people who had transformed the commercial space into a functional living environment with designated areas for sleeping, food preparation, medical care, and communication with the outside world. The group's leader was Dr. James Morrison, a CDC scientist who had been working in the city's research facilities when the outbreak began and had managed to escape with crucial information about the nature of the infection. Dr. Morrison's presence brought both hope and controversy to the survivor community, as his knowledge of the virus's origins made him an invaluable resource for understanding and potentially combating the infection, but his connection to the government research that had created the outbreak also made him a target for blame and suspicion among survivors who had lost everything. Dr. Morrison's revelation that the infection was not a natural phenomenon but rather the result of a failed government experiment designed to enhance human physical and cognitive capabilities sent shockwaves through the survivor community and forced them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the outbreak. The experiment, codenamed Project Renaissance, had been intended to create soldiers with enhanced strength, speed, and resilience, but the viral vector used to deliver the genetic modifications had proven unstable and had resulted in the catastrophic transformation of test subjects into the violent, hunger-driven creatures that were now overrunning the city. Morrison's research team had been working on a cure when the containment breach occurred, and he claimed to have salvaged critical data that could potentially be used to develop a treatment for the infection. But his work would require access to specialized laboratory equipment and materials that were likely to be found only in the most dangerous areas of the city. The arrival of Sarah's group coincided with the discovery of another survivor who would prove crucial to their future survival, former Mayor Patricia Williams, who had been trapped in the city when the outbreak began and had been working to establish communication networks between isolated survivor groups throughout the metropolitan area. Mayor Williams brought news that the military quarantine zones were not as secure as the emergency broadcasts had suggested, with reports of breaches and evacuations that indicated the infection was spreading faster than the authorities could contain it. Her political experience and knowledge of the city's infrastructure made her a natural leader for coordinating the survivors' efforts, but her revelations about the government's role in creating the outbreak also created tensions within the group as they struggled to decide whether to trust Dr. Morrison's claims about working on a cure. The bank building's security was tested when the infected began displaying new behaviors that suggested they were adapting to the survivors' defensive strategies, with coordinated attacks on the building's entrances and evidence that they were communicating with each other through a complex system of vocalizations and gestures. The infected had surrounded the building during the night, their numbers growing steadily as they seemed to be calling others to join their siege, creating a situation where the survivors found themselves trapped with limited supplies and no clear escape route. Elena's voice crackled through the radio with updates from her rooftop position, reporting that the infected were establishing similar sieges around other survivor strongholds throughout the city, suggesting that whatever intelligence was driving their behavior was coordinating a systematic campaign to eliminate the remaining human populations. The part ended with the chilling discovery that some of the infected were attempting to use tools and weapons, indicating that the virus was not only preserving certain cognitive functions but actually enhancing them in ways that made the infected far more dangerous than anyone had initially realized. The decision to venture into the abandoned Genesis research facility came after 3 days of siege at the bank building, during which time the infected had demonstrated increasingly sophisticated tactics that made it clear they were no longer dealing with mindless creatures but with something far more intelligent and dangerous. Dr. James Morrison had convinced the survivor leadership that the research facility contained not only the answers they needed to understand the infection's progression but also the specialized equipment necessary to synthesize a cure from the data he had salvaged during his escape. Sarah Chin found herself torn between her medical oath to help people and her growing suspicion that Morrison might be leading them into a trap, but the deteriorating situation at the bank building left them with few alternatives as their supplies dwindled and the infected siege tactics became more effective with each passing day. The research facility stood like a monument to human ambition and scientific hubris, its modern glass and steel architecture contrasting sharply with the apocalyptic landscape that surrounded it. Detective Alex Thompson led the reconnaissance team through the facility's outer perimeter, his police training helping him identify the security measures that had been implemented before the outbreak and the signs of the violent events that had occurred when the containment breach first happened. The facility's parking garage was littered with abandoned vehicles and personal belongings, telling the story of researchers and staff who had fled in panic as their life's work transformed into humanity's greatest nightmare. Marcus Rodriguez used his military experience to assess the building's defensive positions and potential escape routes, noting that the facility's design had been optimized for containing dangerous biological materials rather than keeping infected creatures out, creating unique challenges for their infiltration mission. Elena Vasquez remained at the bank building to coordinate communications and monitor the infected's movements throughout the city, her engineering expertise proving crucial as she tracked the patterns of infected behavior that suggested they were responding to some form of centralized coordination. Through her radio network, she reported that similar research facilities in other cities were experiencing coordinated attacks, indicating that the infection had evolved beyond localized outbreaks into a phenomenon that was affecting human civilization on a global scale. Her updates provided a constant reminder of the stakes involved in their mission, as it became clear that their small group of survivors might be among the last hope for finding a solution to the spreading catastrophe. The interior of the research facility revealed the true scope of Project Renaissance and the horrifying extent of the experiments that had been conducted in the name of human enhancement. Sarah's medical training allowed her to interpret the research documentation they discovered, revealing that the scientists had been working with multiple viral vectors and genetic modification techniques that had produced a range of different infected variants, each with unique capabilities and characteristics. The facility's laboratories contained evidence of test subjects who had retained their human intelligence while gaining enhanced physical abilities, others who had developed pack-hunting instincts and communication skills, and still others who had become something entirely different from either human or the infected they had encountered in the city streets. Dr. Morrison's behavior became increasingly erratic as they progressed deeper into the facility, his knowledge of the building's layout and security systems raising questions about his true role in the original research project. When they reached the central laboratory where the initial experiments had been conducted, Morrison revealed that he had not been merely a researcher studying the outbreak but had been one of the lead scientists responsible for developing the viral enhancement protocols. His confession that he had volunteered for the initial human trials and had been exposed to an experimental variant of the virus explained his intimate knowledge of the infection's progression and his desperate drive to find a cure, but it also meant that he could potentially transform at any moment into something far more dangerous than the infected they had been fighting. The facility's security systems, which had remained active throughout the outbreak, began responding to their presence with automated lockdown procedures that trapped the survivors in different sections of the building while releasing containment protocols that had been designed to prevent the spread of biological hazards. Sarah found herself separated from the rest of the group in a laboratory filled with research specimens that showed the various stages of the infection's development, including infected subjects who had been preserved in containment units and were still showing signs of awareness and intelligence. The discovery that some of the infected retained their memories and personalities while being driven by the virus's compulsions raised profound moral questions about whether these creatures were still human and whether a cure would be salvation or genocide. The part reached its climax when the facility's automated systems detected the presence of infected creatures within the building and initiated a sterilization protocol that would destroy all biological materials, including the research data that Morrison claimed was necessary for developing a cure. The survivors found themselves racing against time to gather the critical information while being pursued by infected variants that had been contained within the facility and were now free to hunt them through the laboratory corridors. Marcus's military training and Alex's police experience proved crucial as they worked to reunite the separated group members while Sarah and Morrison attempted to download the research data that could potentially save what remained of human civilization from the spreading infection. The escape from the Genesis research facility came at a devastating cost when the building's sterilization protocol activated, destroying not only the contained infected specimens but also most of the research data that Dr. Morrison had claimed was essential for developing a cure. Sarah Chin clutched the single data drive they had managed to salvage, its contents representing what might be humanity's last hope for understanding and reversing the infection that had transformed their world into a nightmare of survival and horror. The group had lost 2 members during their escape, including David Henderson, the teenager who had been with them since the shopping mall encounter, and the loss weighed heavily on everyone as they realized that each mission into the infected territory was becoming more dangerous and costly than the last. Marcus Rodriguez led the survivors through the facility's emergency exit system, his military training proving invaluable as they navigated through service corridors filled with the bodies of researchers and security personnel who had died trying to contain the initial outbreak. The infected they encountered within the facility had been different from those on the streets, displaying enhanced intelligence and coordination that suggested the virus was continuing to evolve and adapt in ways that made their previous survival strategies increasingly obsolete. Dr. Morrison's condition had deteriorated significantly during their time in the facility, his exposure to the experimental virus variant beginning to manifest in ways that made the other survivors question whether he was still entirely human or if he was becoming something else entirely. Detective Alex Thompson's radio crackled with emergency broadcasts that painted a picture of global catastrophe extending far beyond their city's borders, with reports of similar outbreaks in major metropolitan areas around the world and the complete breakdown of international communication and transportation systems. The military quarantine zones that had been their destination were no longer functioning, having been overrun by infected who had demonstrated the ability to coordinate massive assaults that overwhelmed even the most heavily fortified positions. Elena Vasquez's voice provided updates from her rooftop position, reporting that the infected throughout the city were gathering in unprecedented numbers and displaying behaviors that suggested they were preparing for some kind of coordinated action that could eliminate the remaining survivor strongholds. The journey back to the bank building revealed the true extent of the infected's evolution, as the survivors encountered groups of infected who were using primitive tools and weapons, fashioning crude spears from debris and organizing themselves into hunting parties that displayed tactical thinking and strategic planning. Sarah's medical expertise became crucial when several group members were injured during encounters with these evolved infected, but her supplies were running dangerously low and the makeshift medical facilities at the bank building were inadequate for treating the increasingly severe wounds that resulted from fighting opponents who had retained human intelligence while gaining enhanced physical capabilities. The return to the bank building brought the horrifying discovery that their safe haven had been compromised during their absence, with infected having found ways to infiltrate the building's defenses and eliminate several of the survivors who had remained behind. Former Mayor Patricia Williams had been killed while trying to organize the building's defenses, and her death had shattered the morale of the remaining survivors who had looked to her for leadership and hope. The infected had not simply overrun the building in a mindless assault but had demonstrated sophisticated tactics, using coordinated attacks to overwhelm specific defensive positions while other infected groups had infiltrated through the building's service systems in what appeared to be a carefully planned military-style operation. Elena's engineering expertise proved crucial as she worked to restore the building's compromised security systems while also maintaining communication with other survivor groups throughout the city, her reports revealing that similar coordinated attacks were occurring at survivor strongholds across the metropolitan area. The infected were no longer acting as individual creatures driven by hunger and aggression but as members of a collective intelligence that was systematically eliminating human resistance through calculated and strategic warfare. The realization that they were facing an enemy that could learn, adapt, and plan forced the survivors to completely reconsider their approach to survival and their understanding of what the infection had become. Dr. Morrison's transformation accelerated rapidly after their return to the bank building, his exposure to the experimental virus variant causing physical and mental changes that made him increasingly dangerous to the other survivors while also providing him with insights into the infected's collective behavior and strategic planning. His deteriorating condition created a moral dilemma for the group as they struggled to decide whether to try to help him or to eliminate him before he became a threat. But his knowledge of the virus and his potential ability to communicate with the infected collective made him too valuable to abandon despite the risks he posed to their safety. The part concluded with the chilling discovery that the infected were not only coordinating their attacks on survivor strongholds but were also working to systematically destroy the city's infrastructure, targeting power plants, communication facilities, and transportation networks in what appeared to be a deliberate campaign to eliminate the technological advantages that had allowed humans to survive the initial outbreak. The survivors realized that they were no longer simply fighting for their own survival but were engaged in a war for the future of human civilization against an enemy that had evolved beyond their worst nightmares and was becoming more intelligent and dangerous with each passing day. The revelation that Dr. Morrison had successfully isolated a prototype cure from the salvaged research data came at the moment when the survivors' situation seemed most hopeless, as the infected had systematically destroyed most of the city's infrastructure and were preparing for what appeared to be a final coordinated assault on the remaining human strongholds. Sarah Chen worked alongside Morrison in the bank building's makeshift laboratory, her medical expertise helping to verify his claims about the cure's potential effectiveness while also monitoring his increasingly unstable condition as the experimental virus variant continued to transform his physiology and psychology. The prototype cure existed only in theoretical form, requiring specialized equipment and rare chemical compounds that could only be found in the advanced laboratories at Metro General Hospital, the same facility where their nightmare had begun and which was now completely overrun by thousands of infected who had established it as some kind of central gathering point. Elena Vesquez's engineering expertise became crucial as she worked to develop a plan for infiltrating the hospital. Using her knowledge of the building's structural systems and her monitoring of the infected's behavioral patterns to identify potential routes that might allow a small team to reach the hospital's research laboratories without triggering the massive defensive response that the infected had demonstrated whenever survivors attempted to enter their territory. Her radio network provided constant updates on the infected's movements throughout the city, revealing that they were indeed preparing for a coordinated assault on all remaining survivor locations, with massive groups converging on the hospital from all directions as if responding to some form of centralized command that was directing their collective behavior. Detective Alex Thompson volunteered to lead the infiltration mission, his police training and intimate knowledge of the hospital's layout from their previous escape making him the most qualified candidate for the dangerous assignment. Marcus Rodriguez insisted on accompanying the mission despite his injuries from previous encounters, his military experience providing essential tactical knowledge for navigating through hostile territory where the infected had demonstrated increasingly sophisticated defensive strategies. The mission team also included the remaining members of the Henderson family, whose determination to honor their lost son David's memory by contributing to the cure's development had convinced them to take on the dangerous assignment despite their lack of combat experience. The journey back to Metro General Hospital revealed the full extent of the infected's transformation of the city, as they had systematically destroyed or repurposed most of the urban infrastructure to create a maze of barriers and defensive positions that channeled human movement into predetermined kill zones. The infected had established patrol routes and communication networks that allowed them to coordinate their responses to human intrusions, and their ability to use tools and weapons had evolved to include the construction of complex traps and ambush points that required careful navigation and constant vigilance from the infiltration team. Dr. Morrison's condition had deteriorated to the point where he could barely maintain human consciousness, but his connection to the infected collective provided valuable intelligence about their defensive strategies and the location of the specialized equipment needed to synthesize the cure. His transformation had given him the ability to communicate with the infected through the same vocalizations and gestures that they used to coordinate their activities, creating opportunities for the infiltration team to move through infected territory without triggering immediate attack responses, but also raising questions about whether Morrison was still working to help humanity or had become a tool of the infected collective. The hospital had been transformed into a fortress-like structure where the infected had established their apparent command center, with thousands of infected organized into different functional groups that maintained the building's defenses, gathered resources from throughout the city, and coordinated the systematic elimination of human resistance. The building's interior had been modified with crude but effective barriers and defensive positions that demonstrated the infected's ability to engage in complex construction projects. And the research laboratories that contained the equipment needed for the cure had been converted into some kind of breeding or development facility where new variants of the infected were being created through processes that defied medical understanding. Sarah's medical expertise became crucial as the infiltration team worked to reach the hospital's research laboratories, her knowledge of the building's layout and the location of the specialized equipment allowing them to navigate through the infected-controlled territory while avoiding the most heavily defended areas. The mission became a race against time as Elena's radio reports indicated that the infected were beginning their final assault on the remaining survivor strongholds throughout the city, with massive coordinated attacks that suggested they were working to eliminate all human resistance before the cure could be developed and distributed. The part reached its climax when the infiltration team successfully reached the hospital's research laboratories but discovered that the infected had been expecting their arrival and had prepared a trap that would force them to choose between completing their mission to synthesize the cure or escaping with their lives. Dr. Morrison's final transformation into something that was neither human nor infected but represented a bridge between the two species provided the key to understanding the infected's true nature and the potential for coexistence rather than total warfare. But his revelation came at the moment when the team's survival depended on making impossible choices about sacrifice and the future of human civilization. The final confrontation at Metro General Hospital began when Dr. Morrison's transformed state allowed him to communicate with the infected collective, revealing that the trap they had encountered was not intended to destroy the survivors but to force them into a moment of understanding about the true nature of the infection and the possibility of coexistence between the two species that humanity had become. Sarah Chin found herself face-to-face with infected who retained enough of their human consciousness to recognize her as the doctor who had tried to save them during the initial outbreak, their memories intact but their priorities fundamentally altered by the virus that had given them enhanced physical capabilities while changing their relationship to hunger, violence, and social organization. The realization that the infected were not mindless monsters but a transformed version of humanity forced Sarah to reconsider everything she thought she knew about the cure and whether reversing the infection would be salvation or genocide. Marcus Rodriguez and Detective Alex Thompson coordinated the defense of the hospital's research laboratory while Sarah and the remaining members of the Henderson family worked to synthesize the cure using the equipment they had fought so hard to reach. The infected's assault on the laboratory was unlike anything they had experienced before, with coordinated tactical strikes that demonstrated military-level strategic thinking combined with the infected's enhanced physical capabilities and complete disregard for individual survival. Elena's voice crackled through the radio with updates from around the city, reporting that the infected's final assault on survivor strongholds had begun but that her broadcast of the cure's formula was reaching survivor communities around the world, providing hope that humanity might survive even if their small group did not. The synthesis of the cure proceeded under the most dangerous conditions imaginable, with Sarah working to combine the chemical compounds while the infected pressed their attack against the laboratory's defenses. The Henderson family's determination to honor their son's memory by contributing to the cure's development had given them the courage to take on roles they never could have imagined, with Emma and her parents working to maintain the laboratory equipment while Marcus and Alex fought to hold the defensive perimeter. Dr. Morrison's final transformation had given him the ability to serve as a bridge between the human survivors and the infected collective, his communications with both groups helping to coordinate a temporary ceasefire that would allow the cure to be completed and distributed. The cure's completion coincided with the infected's breakthrough into the laboratory, creating a moment of ultimate tension as Sarah had to choose between using the cure to save the infected who had broken through or preserving it for distribution to uninfected survivors around the world. Her decision to administer the cure to the infected attackers revealed its true nature, as it did not reverse the infection but rather restored the infected's human consciousness while allowing them to retain their enhanced physical capabilities, creating a new form of human that combined the best aspects of both species while eliminating the mindless hunger and violence that had made coexistence impossible. The establishment of the broadcast network from the hospital's communication center became a pivotal moment in human history, as Elena's engineering expertise allowed her to transmit the cure's formula and the revelation about its true effects to survivor communities around the world. The broadcast reached not only human survivors but also infected who had retained enough consciousness to understand the message, creating the possibility for negotiated settlements between human and infected communities that could end the warfare and begin the process of rebuilding civilization with both species working together. The final battle for control of the hospital's communication center tested every skill and relationship the survivors had developed throughout their journey, with the infected's coordinated assault being met by the combined efforts of human survivors and newly cured infected who had chosen to help defend the facility. Marcus's military training, Alex's police experience, Sarah's medical expertise, and Elena's engineering knowledge all proved crucial in establishing the defensive perimeter that would protect the broadcast equipment long enough to ensure that the cure's formula reached survivor communities around the world. The story's conclusion revealed that while the immediate battle had been won, the longer-term challenge of rebuilding human civilization would require cooperation between the original human survivors and the enhanced humans who had been created by the infection and then restored to consciousness by the cure. Sarah found herself appointed as the medical director of the new hybrid communities that began forming around the hospital, her expertise in both human medicine and the infection's effects making her invaluable in helping both species adapt to their new reality. Marcus and Alex took on leadership roles in the security forces that would protect the new communities, while Elena became the chief engineer responsible for rebuilding the communication and infrastructure networks that would connect the new settlements. The final scenes showed the establishment of the first integrated human-enhanced human community, with both species working together to rebuild not just their city but their understanding of what it meant to be human in a world where the infection had fundamentally changed the nature of human evolution. The story ended with a message of hope, showing that even in the darkest circumstances, humanity's capacity for adaptation, cooperation, and growth could overcome seemingly impossible challenges and create new possibilities for the future of human civilization.